The Great Viking Army caused havoc in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England between AD 865 to 878, but how much do we really know about their army structure, motives, and consequences? We know about the Great Viking Army from brief mentions in Anglo-Saxon chronicles. They report that a certain Mysilhene, Great Army in Old English, arrived in East Anglia in 865 AD. This is followed by a series of annual entries detailing where the Grand Army went, what battles it fought, and in particular where it spent its winters. From this it is known that she continued to fight various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms across the country until 878 AD, when she was defeated by Alfred the Great at the Battle of Edington in the southwest of England. As Professor Julian Richards of the University of York, author of The Great Viking Army and the Making of England, explained, the peculiarity of this army was that it did not follow the same strategy of fleeting raids, attack and flight, that had previously given rise to the terrible glory of Scandinavian warriors. Previous attacks have usually been on rather isolated and defenseless coastal monasteries, especially on the east coast of the British Isles, with the capture of slaves and treasure, and subsequent disappearance. But the Grand Army had wintered in England and clearly had strategic plans to stay longer. They eventually turned their raids into systematic land grabs that led to permanent settlements. This was a moment of marked change in Viking strategy, and subsequent armies usually arrived for political conquest rather than just temporary raids. I think the reason for this change was that they saw opportunities. Parts of the army raided Ireland and continental Europe in 850 and 860 AD and probably learned that there were many feuds between the four main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England, Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria, and Wessex, Richards explained. During their coastal raids, which were practically reconnaissance missions, the Vikings also saw the wealth available in England, especially in its churches and monasteries. When things got tough on the continent in the 860s AD, the Carolingian Empire was better organized to crush their armies. They probably saw an opportunity to do better in England. The Grand Army was a loose association of various groups of warriors, and although they came from different parts of Scandinavia, they also invaded Ireland and the continent. So it's easy to deduce that as they advanced, they gathered more and more troops. It is important to note that although we call it a Viking army, it is likely that there were other mercenaries among them. Each unit was loyal to its leaders, who rewarded them for their service in battle. Probably, there was a lot of competition between the leaders of these different detachments, writes a professor from York. At some point, a summer army joined the Grand Army to make it even bigger, giving them enough strength to last through the winter period. But we are also told of one incident. After the army spent the winter at Repton in 873–74 AD, when it split, one part went north, and the other went to East Anglia, and then back to Wessex. The army has not always been a single force. Among the names mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles are a few that will surely sound familiar to fans of TV shows like Vikings or The Last Kingdom. For example, Ub is mentioned, although, unfortunately, little is said about him. But we know a lot more about characters like Guthrum, one of the original leaders of the Grand Army, who constantly appears in the chronicles. When the army split in AD 873–74, Guthrum traveled to England and became famous for being defeated by Alfred the Great at the Battle of Edington. When Alfred demands that Guthrum convert to Christianity, Guthrum ends up being baptized along with 30 of his fellow warriors and later becomes king. There is also Halfdan, another leader of the Great Army, who was also among the Vikings during the wintering of 873–74 AD. This Scandinavian moved into Northumbria when the army split up, seizing lands and settlements there. Ivar the Boneless also appears in this story. He is believed to have been one of the first leaders to land in 865 AD, and possibly overwintering in 873–74, which is usually associated with the founding of a fortress in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, although it is possible that at some point he sailed to Ireland. There is some confusion when examining the sources as these names continue to appear in different parts of the British Isles in slightly different forms. The Grand Army had its ups and downs. For example, in the early stages, the Vikings captured York, originally the capital of Northumbria, but were later expelled and they returned to retake the city. However, the general picture we get from the Anglo-Saxon chronicles is that the Vikings won most of their battles, and this is partly because England was divided into several kingdoms, which, in turn, were at enmity with each other. According to King Alfred's biographer, it was not until 878 that he managed to win over many of the Anglo-Saxon lords to his side and raise a powerful enough army to resist the Vikings. This alliance, under the old motto "The enemies of my enemies are my friends," is the cause of the really first major defeat that the Vikings suffered in England. Until recently, we knew little about the Grand Army in terms of archaeology, but the situation has changed. Excavations at Repton accidentally unearthed, as they originally looked for a church in Mercia and the sanctuary of St. Wistan, Viking burials and evidence that, according to archaeologists, it was part of a Viking camp. There is also one particular place at a place called Torksey in Lincolnshire, which was part of Mercia and, like Repton, is on a river, specifically the navigable River Trent. Torksey is mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles as the place where the Great Viking Army wintered a year before their arrival in Repton in 872–73 AD. To date, Torksey is just a small town. There is nothing to indicate that at the end of the 9th century there was a Viking camp here, but over the years, archaeologists began to make incredible finds north of the city. These were mainly silver items, including coins, ingots and fragments of faceted silver jewelry. These finds are familiar to archaeologists studying the past of the Vikings. They call it pirate silver because it comes from the practice of cutting objects as part of the economy of bullinism. The accumulation of precious metals is the only possible wealth. It seems that the Vikings spent their winters processing booty, treasures from their raids. We worked with forensics to trace where the finds came from, and they were from an area that far exceeded the Repton camp. This is an area of about 55 hectares, which by modern standards would be equal to about 75 football fields. Richards specified, "It really changed our minds about the size of the army, since an army based in Repton could only have a few hundred men, whereas what we have found at Torksey and other recently discovered camps suggests a much larger scale." The professor noted, "All of this is really based on evidence from metal detectors over the last 10 years. We discovered places that we never knew about before, that are not mentioned in historical sources. This is a case where archaeology and metal discovery really adds to what we know about history," Richards said. Although the Vikings spent their time looting, this did not mean that they did not have fun. One of the most interesting finds is not silver and ingots, but small pieces of lead. It seems that during the long winter these Viking warriors were playing some kind of game. In later Scandinavian sources it is known as Nefadafel, and it probably looked a bit like chess in the sense that one side had a king that the other side tried to capture. More than 300 of these small lead-playing pieces have been found on Torksey. Please remember that we all have different opinions. Think before you say or write something cruel towards others. After all, we are only human. To share your experience or leave a comment, just write below. Join history. Dear friend, thank you for your attention. We hope you appreciate the modest work of the authors of this channel.